On a crisp morning in mid-March of 1943, somewhere high above the industrial cityscape of Frankfurt, Germany, a seasoned Luftwaffe pilot named Johannes Steinhoff was experiencing what would later be remembered as the golden age of German fighter aviation. Steinhoff wasn't just any pilot. He had survived the brutal aerial combat over Britain during the summer and fall of 1940, and he'd endured the savage Eastern Front where the skies were filled with Soviet aircraft and the ground below was an endless expanse of hostile territory. For him and his fellow elite aviators, the men they called the Experten, 1943 represented a period of almost complete dominance in the skies over their homeland. These weren't ordinary pilots with a handful of victories under their belts. These were men with dozens of confirmed kills, and some had even surpassed 100 enemy aircraft destroyed. They owned the airspace deep within the borders of the Third Reich, and they knew it with a confidence that bordered on certainty. The reason for this absolute control was simple, tactical, and brutally effective. The Allied fighter aircraft that escorted the American and British bomber formations simply couldn't follow them all the way to their targets and return home safely. The fuel tanks on these escort fighters were too small, their operational radius too limited. Take the legendary British Spitfire, for instance. This magnificent aircraft, which had become the symbol of British resistance during the darkest days of the Battle of Britain, was an exceptional dogfighter with superb handling characteristics and impressive performance. But it had one critical weakness when it came to escort duty over continental Europe. Its range was so restricted that it could barely make it across the English Channel, provide minimal protection to the bomber formations, and then race back to England before its tanks ran dry. The Spitfire was a defensive weapon, perfect for protecting British airspace, but almost useless for offensive operations deep into enemy territory. The Americans had brought their own fighter to the theatre, the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This was an entirely different beast from the elegant Spitfire. The Thunderbolt was huge, weighing in at over 7 tons when fully loaded, and it was powered by an enormous radial engine that gave it devastating speed in a dive and the ability to absorb tremendous punishment. American pilots affectionately called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and it could dish out and take more punishment than almost any other fighter in the sky. The P-47 had better range than the Spitfire thanks to its larger internal fuel capacity and the ability to carry external drop tanks, but even this formidable machine had its limits. The Thunderbolts could escort the bomber formations deeper into German territory than the Spitfires could, but they still had to turn back long before the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators reached the most critical industrial targets in the heart of Germany. The German fighter pilots had developed a devastatingly effective tactical approach to exploit this vulnerability. It was a system born from experience, refined through countless engagements, and executed with lethal precision. They would wait and watch as the American bomber formations lumbered toward their targets, escorted by their P-47 protectors. The German pilots would shadow the formations, sometimes harassing them with probing attacks, but mostly they exercised patience. They knew that fuel gauges in those escort fighters were steadily dropping, that every minute in the air brought those Thunderbolt pilots closer to a critical decision point. Eventually, inevitably, the escorts would reach what pilots called their bingo fuel level, the point at which they absolutely had to turn around or risk running out of gas before reaching home. When those little friends, as the bomber crews called their fighter escorts, finally peeled away and headed west, that's when the real slaughter would begin. The bomber formations, now stripped of their protective screen of fighters, became naked and vulnerable targets. They were still dangerous, make no mistake. Each B-17 bristled with up to 13 50 caliber machine guns, manned by trained aerial gunners who could put up a withering curtain of defensive fire. When multiple bombers flew in tight formation, their combined firepower created what the Americans called a combat box, a formation designed to maximize their defensive capabilities and minimize blind spots. But the German pilots had figured out how to crack this defensive formation. They had learned through hard experience and lost comrades where the weaknesses were, and they exploited them ruthlessly. The skies over the Reich belonged to the Luftwaffe, and they defended their homeland with a ferocity born from the knowledge that every factory they protected, every target they kept the bombers from reaching, meant their families below had a better chance of survival. For men like Johannes Steinhoff and his fellow aces, the situation in 1943 was as close to ideal as war ever gets. They could operate from their own airfields, deep in friendly territory, with ground crews who knew their aircraft intimately and could turn them around quickly. If they damaged their aircraft in combat, they could often nurse it back to a friendly field. If they had to bail out, they'd land among friends who would get them back to their units. The home field advantage was enormous, and it showed in their effectiveness and their survival rates. Then came 1944, and everything changed. The fortress that had seemed so impregnable was suddenly shockingly vulnerable. The hunters who had prowled the edges of German airspace, forced to turn back by fuel limitations, were suddenly everywhere. They weren't just at the gates anymore, threatening from the periphery. They were deep inside, waiting in ambush from the moment a German pilot lifted his wheels off the runway. The sanctuary was gone. For veteran pilots like Adolf Galland, who held the position of General der Jagdflieger, or General of Fighters, responsible for all single-engine fighter operations for the Luftwaffe, the moment he first spotted a new type of American fighter over Berlin was more than just a tactical setback. It was a psychological breaking point, a moment when he understood with terrible clarity that the war in the air had fundamentally shifted. The sight of that sleek silver aircraft cruising over the German capital, hundreds of miles from its base in England, represented something that should have been impossible. But there it was, undeniable proof that the rules had changed. This transformation, this complete reversal of fortune in the aerial war over Europe, is the story of a single aircraft type that rewrote the strategic calculus of the entire conflict. It's the story of how one American fighter, through a combination of innovative design, fortuitous engineering choices, and sheer capability, managed to accomplish something that had seemed beyond reach. It didn't just provide better escort to the bombers or win more dogfights, though it certainly did both of those things. What it did was far more profound and far more devastating to the enemy. It systematically stripped away every advantage the Luftwaffe had carefully built up over years of combat. It erased the safe zones, eliminated the sanctuaries, and turned the hunters into the hunted. It broke not just aircraft and killed not just pilots, but shattered the institutional confidence and morale of an entire air force. During the Second World War, certain weapons systems achieved legendary status that has endured for generations. The German Tiger tank, with its thick armour and powerful 88mm gun, became synonymous with armoured warfare terror, even though it was mechanically unreliable and produced in relatively small numbers. The British Spitfire became the symbol of British defiance and remained one of the most recognisable aircraft silhouettes in history. The Soviet T-34 tank combined sloped armour, a powerful gun, and mechanical reliability in a package that could be mass-produced, making it arguably the best tank design of the war. But legends, especially in warfare, can be tricky things to analyse. They often grow from a single overwhelming advantage or a particular moment in time when conditions aligned perfectly for that weapon system to excel. For one particular American fighter aircraft, that overwhelming advantage wasn't found in its top speed, though it was indeed fast. It wasn't in its armament, though it packed 6 50-caliber machine guns with enough ammunition to stay in a fight. It wasn't even in its maneuverability, though it could hold its own against any fighter the Axis powers could field. No, the greatest weapon this aircraft possessed was something less tangible, something that couldn't be measured in horsepower or ammunition weight or rate of climb. Its greatest weapon was range, the ability to fly deeper into enemy territory than anyone thought possible, to stay there longer, and to still have enough fuel to fight its way home. The P-51 Mustang achieved something that no other fighter aircraft of the war truly could, not the Spitfire, not the Thunderbolt, not the German Bf-109 or Fw-190, not the Japanese Zero or the Soviet Yak fighters. It didn't just win air-to-air engagements, though it won plenty of those. It didn't just shoot down enemy aircraft, though it destroyed thousands of them. What it did was far more strategic and far more psychologically devastating. It systematically broke the will of the entire German Air Force. It accomplished this feat by taking away the one thing that every soldier, whether on the ground or in the air, needs to maintain their effectiveness and their sanity. It took away their safe place to return to, their sanctuary, their home. To understand why the P-51 Mustang became such a terrifying presence in the skies over Europe, why German pilots came to dread the sight of its distinctive profile, you first need to understand the grim and bloody reality of the air war as it existed in 1943, before the Mustang arrived in significant numbers. The American 8th Air Force, operating from bases scattered across the English countryside, had been assigned an enormously ambitious and dangerous mission. They were tasked with destroying Germany's war-making capacity through a campaign of strategic bombing conducted in daylight at high altitude. The theory behind this campaign was based on some reasonable assumptions and some that proved to be tragically optimistic. The Americans believed that their heavy bombers, particularly the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, could defend themselves adequately against enemy fighters if they flew in tight formation. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men and bristled with up to 13 50 caliber machine guns positioned to cover different sectors around the aircraft. When multiple bombers flew in a carefully coordinated formation called a combat box, they could theoretically create overlapping fields of fire that would make it suicidal for enemy fighters to attack. The bombers would be a flying porcupine of defensive fire, and no fighter pilot would be crazy enough to press an attack through that curtain of lead. It was a brave theory, meticulously planned by staff officers and strategists. It looked good on paper and in the briefing rooms. But when it met the reality of combat against the experienced, determined and innovative Luftwaffe, it proved to be tragically, fatally flawed. The German pilots weren't just good. They were among the best fighter pilots the world had ever seen, veterans of multiple campaigns who had learned their deadly trade in the skies over Poland, France, Britain and Russia. They flew excellent aircraft, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf-109, which had been continuously refined since the Spanish Civil War, and the newer Focke-Wulf Fw-190, a radial engine fighter that had shocked the RAF when it first appeared with its superior performance. These German pilots, these Experten, were masters of their lethal craft, and they quickly figured out how to crack the American combat box formation. They discovered that attacking from head-on, directly into the nose of the bomber formation, gave them several crucial advantages. First, the closing speed was tremendous, often exceeding 600 miles per hour, which meant the bomber's gunners had only seconds to acquire the target, aim and fire before the German fighter flashed past. Second, this head-on approach exploited a critical weakness in the bomber's defensive armament. The nose of a B-17 had fewer guns covering it than other angles, creating a comparative blind spot. Third, the German fighters could concentrate their fire on the pilots and cockpit area, potentially killing or incapacitating the crew with a single good burst. The German tactics evolved into a devastating system. They would attack in waves, multiple fighters coming in sequence from the same angle to overwhelm the gunners and prevent them from effectively engaging each target. They learned to focus their attacks on single bombers, concentrating multiple fighters' fire on one aircraft until it fell out of formation. Once a bomber left the protective envelope of the formation, whether due to damage, dead engines, or wounded crew, it became easy prey for the circling German fighters who would swarm it like wolves on a wounded deer, finishing it off with methodical efficiency. The results of these tactics were absolutely catastrophic for the American bomber crews. The 8th Air Force had established a policy that bomber crew members would complete a tour of duty after flying 25 combat missions over occupied Europe. After 25 missions, if you survived, you got to go home. It seemed reasonable on paper, a clear goal that gave men something to count toward, a light at the end of the tunnel. But the cold, hard mathematics of combat told a different story. In 1943, statistical analysis showed that the probability of an American bomber crewman actually surviving to complete his 25-mission tour was approximately 25%. 1 in 4. The other 75% would be killed, captured, or seriously wounded before they could finish their tour. Think about what that meant for the young men climbing into those bombers before each mission. They weren't stupid. They could count. They could see the empty bunks in their barracks. They knew that statistically they were unlikely to survive. Every mission was a roll of the dice with death, and the house had better odds. The skies over the Third Reich had become a deadly proving ground where American resolve and industrial capacity were being tested against German skill and determination, and in 1943 the Americans were losing that test badly. This bloody period of the air war reached its peak during the summer and autumn of 1943. Mission after mission saw horrific loss rates. In August, a dual raid was launched against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. These were critical targets. Ball bearings were essential components in everything from aircraft to tanks to trucks, and Schweinfurt produced a huge percentage of Germany's supply. The Messerschmitt factory was churning out the fighters that were shooting down the bombers, so destroying it made perfect sense. 376 B-17s were dispatched on this mission. 60 of them were shot down. That's 600 men lost, killed or captured in a single afternoon's work. The crews who made it back were exhausted, traumatized, and many were wounded. The aircraft that survived were often so shot up they required extensive repairs before they could fly again. But as terrible as that August mission was, it wasn't the worst. That distinction belongs to a day that has gone down in history with a name that captures its horror. Black Thursday. October 14th, 1943. The target, once again, was the ball-bearing production facilities at Schweinfurt. The planners deemed it so vital that it was worth any price, any cost in men and machines. 291 B-17 flying fortresses were dispatched deep into Germany. 60 of them were shot down over enemy territory, their crews killed or captured. Another 17 bombers made it back to England so badly damaged that they were deemed beyond repair and were scrapped. In total, 77 heavy bombers were gone, representing an investment of millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of man-hours of production. More importantly, more than 600 American airmen didn't come home that day. The loss rate was a staggering 26%. More than 1 in 4 aircraft that took off that morning never came back. The 8th Air Force was bleeding to death. The losses were completely, utterly unsustainable at any level of analysis. You couldn't replace the crews fast enough. You couldn't replace the aircraft fast enough. The training pipeline couldn't keep up. The industrial production couldn't keep up. And even if they could, the morale impact of sending men out to die at these rates would eventually break even the most determined force. The American commanders were forced to face a terrible, unpalatable truth that contradicted their entire strategic approach. The unescorted daylight bombing campaign, the centerpiece of American air strategy in Europe, was failing. The Luftwaffe was winning the air war. The tactical situation was straightforward and brutally simple. The German pilots had figured out that they could wait, conserve their fuel, and avoid serious combat until the P-47 Thunderbolts and the few Spitfires that could make it across the Channel reached their fuel limits and had to turn for home. The heart of Germany, where the most vital industrial targets were located, was protected by an invisible wall, a fortress created not by anti-aircraft guns or fighters stationed at the targets, but by the simple tyranny of fuel capacity and range in the Allied escort fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots knew exactly where that wall was, knew exactly when the escorts would have to leave, and they exploited that knowledge ruthlessly. The German pilots enjoyed every possible advantage. They were fighting over their own territory, which meant that if their aircraft was damaged, they could often make it to a friendly airfield. If they had to bail out, they'd land among friends who would get them medical care and back to their units. They could take off, engage in combat, land to refuel and rearm, and go back up for another sortie, all while operating from familiar bases with experienced ground crews. Their morale was high because they were defending their homeland, their cities, their families. They were damn good at their jobs, and they were operating under rules of engagement that heavily favoured the defence. But those rules, which had governed the air war for years, were about to be completely and permanently rewritten by an aircraft that was, in many ways, an unlikely hero of the conflict. An aircraft that would not merely challenge the Luftwaffe in air-to-air combat, but would haunt it, break it, and ultimately destroy it as an effective fighting force. The story of how the P-51 Mustang came to exist is almost as remarkable as what it went on to achieve. It wasn't born from a grand, carefully planned, multi-year development program overseen by military strategists. It was, in many ways, a happy accident combined with a stroke of engineering genius and excellent timing. In 1940, while the Battle of Britain was raging in the skies over southern England, a British purchasing commission approached North American Aviation, an American aircraft manufacturer based in California. The British weren't asking North American to design anything new. They simply wanted the company to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license to supplement British production capacity. The P-40 was a solid, workmanlike fighter. It was tough, it could take punishment, and it was relatively simple to maintain. But by 1940, it was already becoming obsolescent. It couldn't match the performance of the latest German Messerschmitt Bf-109E models or the newer FW-190 that would appear soon. Building more P-40s would help with numbers, but it wouldn't give the Allies a technological edge. James Dutch Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, saw an opportunity. Instead of just becoming another contractor, building someone else's aging design, he made a bold, audacious counteroffer to the British. He promised that his company could design and build a completely new fighter aircraft that would be significantly better than the P-40, and they could do it in just 120 days from signing the contract. The British, desperate for aircraft of any kind and willing to gamble on American industrial capability, agreed to this proposal. What followed was an incredible feat of engineering and manufacturing. In just 102 days, barely over 3 months, North American Aviation rolled out the prototype designated NA-73X. This wasn't just a mock-up or a design study. This was a complete, flyable aircraft built from a clean sheet of paper in less time than it takes to complete a typical college semester. These early Mustangs, designated Mustang Mark I by the British and eventually P-51 by the Americans, were powered by Allison V1710 engines, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plant that was thoroughly American in design and manufacture. The aircraft showed tremendous promise in some areas, but had significant limitations in others. At low altitudes, below about 15,000 feet, the early Mustangs were fast and handled beautifully. They were a joy to fly, responsive and stable. The secret to their impressive performance was a revolutionary wing design called a laminar flow airfoil. Traditional wing designs of the era had airflow that quickly became turbulent as it passed over the wing surface. This turbulence created drag, and drag meant you needed more power to go faster or you burned more fuel to maintain the same speed. The North American design team, led by Chief Engineer Edgar Schmude, designed a wing with a different profile, one that was carefully shaped to keep the air flowing smoothly over the surface for as long as possible before it transitioned to turbulent flow. This laminar flow wing drastically reduced drag, which meant the aircraft could fly faster and, crucially, could fly farther on the same amount of fuel. It was an elegant solution that would prove to be one of the keys to the Mustang's eventual success. But there was a significant problem that threatened to relegate the Mustang to a secondary role. The Allison engine, for all its merits, had one critical flaw. It performed well at low altitudes, but choked and lost power in the thin air at high altitudes, precisely where the heavy bomber formations operated, typically between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. The issue was the engine's supercharger, essentially a compressor that forced more air into the engine to compensate for the decreasing air density at altitude. The Allison's single-stage supercharger was adequate for low-altitude work, but it couldn't maintain power up high where the air was thin. Without good high-altitude performance, the Mustang couldn't effectively escort the high-altitude bombers, which meant it might end up relegated to ground attack and reconnaissance roles. The aircraft could have ended its career as just another decent but not exceptional fighter, a footnote in aviation history. But fortune intervened in the form of an RAF test pilot named Ronald Harker. In April 1942, Harker flew one of the early Allison-powered Mustangs and was immediately impressed by the airframe's handling characteristics and its speed down low. But he also recognized the altitude problem. Harker had a brilliant insight. He suggested mating this exceptional American airframe with the engine that had proven it could master high-altitude operations, the legendary British Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Merlin engine had powered the Spitfire to victory in the Battle of Britain and had been continuously refined and improved since its introduction. The latest versions featured a revolutionary two-stage, two-speed supercharger that worked like an automatic transmission for altitude. At sea level and low altitudes, only the first stage of supercharging engaged. As the aircraft climbed and the air thinned, the second stage would automatically engage, compressing the thin air even more and forcing it into the engine, allowing it to maintain close to its sea-level power output even up in the stratosphere. It was a remarkable piece of engineering that solved the exact problem the Mustang had. In an amazing example of transatlantic cooperation, Rolls-Royce fitted a Mustang airframe with their latest Merlin 60 series engine. The results were nothing short of breathtaking. The marriage of the sleek, low-drag American airframe with the powerful, high-altitude British engine created what many aviation historians consider to be the finest piston-engine fighter aircraft of the entire war. The performance improvement was dramatic and immediately obvious. The new Merlin-powered variant could match or exceed the performance of any Axis fighter at any altitude. It was fast, climbing to high altitude quickly, it was maneuverable, and it could fight effectively from sea level up to 40,000 feet. Packard Motor Company in the United States was already producing the Merlin engine under license from Rolls-Royce, which meant that American production wouldn't depend on engines shipped across the Atlantic. Soon, production lines were churning out Merlin-powered Mustangs in large numbers. The definitive variant, the P-51D, featured several improvements over earlier models, including a bubble canopy that gave the pilot unobstructed all-around visibility, crucial in the swirling chaos of air combat where the fighter you didn't see was the one that killed you. But while the Merlin engine solved the altitude problem and gave the Mustang world-class performance, it was only half of the story, only half of what made this aircraft truly revolutionary. The other half, the element that would change the entire strategic situation in the European air war, was range. The Mustang's aerodynamically clean design already gave it excellent fuel efficiency. It simply didn't burn as much fuel per mile travelled as chunkier, draggier designs like the P-47 Thunderbolt. But the North American designers pushed this advantage even further. They added an 85-gallon fuel tank behind the pilot's seat. This fuselage tank, combined with the wing tanks that all fighters carried, gave the Mustang impressive internal fuel capacity. But the real game-changer came when you added external fuel tanks. Drop tanks, as they were called, were expendable fuel tanks that could be attached under the wings or fuselage. They were used to extend range for the ferry flight or the flight to the combat area, and then jettisoned when empty or when the aircraft needed to enter combat and needed maximum maneuverability. The Mustang could carry 2 large drop tanks under its wings, each holding up to 110 or even 150 gallons, depending on the variant. When you combined the internal fuel with full drop tanks, a P-51D could carry over 500 gallons of fuel. Combined with its efficient design, this gave the Mustang a combat radius, the distance it could fly out, engage in combat, and return home, of over 650 miles. Some missions, when everything went perfectly, saw Mustangs operating over 800 miles from their bases. Think about what that meant strategically. For the first time in the war, there was an escort fighter that could accompany the bombers all the way to any target in the Third Reich and still have enough fuel to fight and make it home. Berlin was within reach. The oil refineries at Ploesti could be hit. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt could be struck with proper fighter escort all the way there and back. The invisible protective wall, the fortress created by range limitations, was shattered. Suddenly, there was nowhere left for the Luftwaffe to hide, no sanctuary where they could operate without fear of encountering American fighters. The first Merlin-powered Mustangs began arriving over Germany in late 1943, and initially they were just a quiet tremor, a hint of the earthquake that was coming. At first, German pilots simply noted in their combat reports that they were encountering American escort fighters farther east than before, deeper into German territory than should have been possible. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall and head of the Luftwaffe, initially dismissed these reports. Göring was a World War I fighter ace himself, but by this point in the war he was overweight, drug-addicted, and increasingly disconnected from reality. He didn't want to believe that American fighters could reach Berlin, because if they could, it meant his promises to Hitler that the Reich would never be bombed were completely empty. Then came March 4th, 1944, and something happened that could not be dismissed or explained away. American fighters appeared over Berlin itself, the capital of the Third Reich, over 500 miles from their bases in England. The psychological impact of this development cannot be overstated. Whether or not Göring actually said the famous quote attributed to him doesn't really matter. The quote goes, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Whether those exact words came out of his mouth or not, they captured the truth of the situation. It was an admission, an acknowledgement that the entire air war had fundamentally changed and that Germany was now on the losing side of that change. The fortress was breached. The sanctuary was gone. The rules had been rewritten. To truly understand the terror and demoralization this caused among German pilots, we need to put ourselves in the cockpit to imagine what daily life became like for a German fighter pilot after the Mustang arrived in force. Let's create a composite German pilot and call him Hans. He's an experienced pilot by this point in the war, maybe with 20 or 30 kills, flying a Messerschmitt Bf-109G model from an airfield somewhere in Western Germany. Before the Mustang, before that long-range American fighter showed up, Hans's life was dangerous, certainly. This was combat aviation, and people died regularly. But there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that made it manageable psychologically. Hans would get the alert that American bombers were approaching. He and his squadron mates would scramble, running to their aircraft while ground crews helped them strap in. They'd take off, form up with other squadrons, and climb to intercept altitude. They'd spot the bomber formations, those huge boxes of B-17 and B-24s droning toward their targets. They'd also spot the American fighters, those P-47 Thunderbolts trying to protect the bombers. Hans and his fellow pilots would engage, tangling with the Thunderbolts, but always with an eye on their fuel gauges, because they knew with absolute certainty that those American fighters couldn't stay forever. The P-47s had their limits. At a certain point, at a certain invisible line in the sky determined by fuel consumption and the distance back to England, those Thunderbolts would have to break off and head for home. They had no choice. Stay too long and they'd run out of fuel over enemy territory, which meant a dead engine, a forced landing, and a prisoner of war camp if they were lucky, or death if they weren't. So Hans and his comrades would fight the escorts, but they could disengage if necessary, avoid them if the odds were bad, because they knew relief was coming. Once the escorts turned back, the real work would begin. The bombers, now unprotected except for their own guns, would be vulnerable. The German fighters could make their attack runs, using the tactics they'd perfected over hundreds of engagements. The airspace deep inside Germany was their office, their workspace, and they controlled it. Then everything changed in early 1944. Now, when Hans gets the scramble order and runs to his aircraft, the dynamic is completely different. The hunt starts the moment his wheels leave the ground. As his Bf-109 climbs away from the airfield, Hans's head is constantly moving, his eyes scanning every sector of the sky, looking for that flash of silver that means death. The American Mustang pilots, freed from the previous directive that required them to stay close to the bombers, are now actively hunting German fighters. In February 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force, issued a new directive to his fighter groups. Instead of staying glued to the bomber formations in close escort, the fighters were now authorized to roam ahead to the sides and to pursue German fighters aggressively. "Go after the Luftwaffe," Doolittle told his pilots. "Destroy them in the air and on the ground." For Hans, this means there's no safe space to form up with his squadron anymore. There's no leisurely climb to altitude where he can check his instruments, test his guns, and mentally prepare for combat. From the moment of takeoff to the moment of landing, Hans is the hunted one. The Mustangs are like ghosts appearing out of nowhere. They dive out of the sun, the classic attack angle where they're invisible until the last second. Before Hans even knows they're there, he hears the terrifying sound of 650 caliber machine guns opening fire, sees the tracers streaking past his canopy, feels the impacts if he's unlucky as heavy bullets tear through aluminum skin and vital components. The nature of the air battle has fundamentally changed. It's no longer a somewhat structured engagement fought over the bomber formations at predictable times and places. Now it's a desperate, chaotic brawl that can happen anywhere, at any altitude, at any time. Hans might get jumped while climbing to altitude. He might get ambushed while trying to position his squadron for an attack on the bombers. He might be engaged while trying to disengage from a previous fight to go rearm and refuel. There are no timeouts, no safe zones, no moments when he can relax his vigilance. And even if Hans survives the mission, even if he fights off the Mustangs or evades them, even if he makes his attack on the bombers and manages to damage or destroy one, even if he makes it back toward his home airfield with his aircraft still flyable and his fuel gauge showing enough to land, the danger is far from over. In fact, he's approaching one of the most vulnerable moments of the entire mission. The landing approach, which used to be a moment of relief, a chance to breathe easier because you'd made it home, is now the moment of greatest danger. Because the Mustangs are waiting there too. American pilots had begun targeting German airfields with aggressive low-level strafing attacks. It was a brutally effective tactic that maximized the Mustangs' advantages and exploited German vulnerabilities. The American pilots would cruise at medium altitude until they spotted a German airfield, then push the nose down and dive to treetop level, building up tremendous speed, sometimes over 400 miles per hour. They'd come screaming across the airfield at virtually zero altitude, too low for the anti-aircraft guns to track them effectively, and they'd open fire on anything that moved or looked valuable. Parked aircraft, carefully lined up or dispersed around the field, would explode or catch fire as 50 caliber bullets tore through them. Fuel trucks would erupt in massive fireballs. Ammunition dumps would detonate in chain reactions. Buildings would be riddled with bullets. Anyone caught in the open, whether ground crew or pilot, would be cut down. And worst of all, aircraft in the landing pattern or just touching down at their slowest and most vulnerable would be easy targets. For Hans, trying to land his battle-damaged Bf-109 with maybe one gun still working and fuel for perhaps 5 more minutes of flight, there is no greater terror. He's slow, maybe 150 miles per hour or less. He's completely committed to the landing approach. He can't suddenly firewall the throttle and climb away because his aircraft is already damaged and he doesn't have the fuel for another circuit. He's a sitting duck and he knows it. The airfield, once his sanctuary, the place where he was supposed to be safe, has become just another part of the front line, just another place where death can find him. This constant, grinding, unrelenting pressure created a crisis that rippled through every level of the Luftwaffe. Veteran aces, the Experten who had been the backbone of the German fighter force, were being steadily attrited. Some were killed in combat. Some were wounded seriously enough that they never returned to operations. Some simply reached the breaking point psychologically and had to be pulled from combat duty. These were men with hundreds of combat missions, men who had survived years of warfare, men whose experience and skills were irreplaceable. And they were being systematically eliminated. Men like Adolf Galland, the general of fighters who was still flying combat missions himself despite his administrative role, watched this disaster unfold with growing horror. Galland understood the mathematics of attrition warfare. The Americans could afford to trade aircraft for aircraft, pilot for pilot. American industrial capacity meant they could replace losses. American training programs meant they had a pipeline of new pilots. Germany had neither of those advantages. Every pilot lost was one that couldn't be easily replaced. Every experienced ace who died took decades of combat knowledge with him. The exchange rate didn't have to favour the Allies by much for Germany to lose in the long run, and the exchange rate was starting to heavily favour the Allies. As the veteran pilots were lost, the Luftwaffe had no choice but to reduce the training given to replacement pilots. Early in the war, a German fighter pilot received over 200 hours of flight training before being considered ready for combat operations. This extensive training produced skilled pilots who could survive their early missions long enough to gain experience. But by 1944, the training program had been slashed out of desperate necessity. New pilots were being rushed to frontline squadrons with as little as 160 hours of flight time, sometimes even less. This was barely enough time to learn how to fly the aircraft competently, let alone to master the complex skills of air combat, gunnery, formation flying, navigation, and all the other things a fighter pilot needed to survive. Meanwhile, their American opponents were receiving vastly more training. An American fighter pilot typically had over 400 hours of flight time before seeing combat, more than twice what the Germans were getting. American pilots practiced gunnery extensively. They flew hundreds of hours of formation flying. They learned navigation until it was second nature. They arrived at their combat squadrons with a solid foundation of skills that gave them a fighting chance from their very first mission. Now imagine being an 18-year-old German kid, fresh out of a truncated training program. You barely know how to fly your Bf-109. You've never fired your guns at a moving target. You don't really understand tactical formations. You've never experienced the disorientation of combat, the tunnel vision, the G-forces in a hard turn, the terror of being shot at. And then you're thrown into a swirling furball with 50 aircraft maneuvering violently in a few cubic miles of sky, with experienced American pilots actively looking for easy prey like you, flying aircraft that are at least as good as yours and maybe better, and they have 4 times your experience and training. It was a death sentence for most of these young pilots. They were lost in droves, often on their first few missions. This created a vicious cycle that became a death spiral for the Luftwaffe. The veterans were being killed or wounded. The green replacements, inadequately trained, were being slaughtered. This forced the training schools to send even less prepared pilots, who died even faster, which required even more replacements with even less training. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing a war of attrition, it was being systematically dismantled, its institutional competence destroyed, its ability to train and retain skilled pilots collapsing. The psychological toll was immense. Morale throughout the Luftwaffe fighter force hit rock bottom. A grim joke began circulating in the mess halls and ready rooms, repeated with the black humour that combat veterans develop as a coping mechanism. The joke went like this: if you see a silver aircraft, it's American. If you see a camouflaged aircraft, it's British. If you don't see any aircraft at all, that's the Luftwaffe. It was gallows humour, born from despair and exhaustion. But like all good dark jokes, it contained a core of bitter truth. The P-51 Mustang had become the ghost in the sky, the silver phantom, the constant reminder that there was no escape, no safe zone, no sanctuary, and ultimately no hope of winning. The story of the Luftwaffe's catastrophic collapse in 1944 isn't just about subjective factors like fear and morale, though those were certainly real and important. The collapse is also written in cold, hard, undeniable numbers that tell a story of systematic destruction. The statistics from this period paint a devastating picture, and the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang in significant numbers is clearly visible as the turning point in every chart and graph. Let's start with the bombers, because protecting them was the whole point of the escort fighters. Before the Mustang's arrival, bomber loss rates over 10% were common on deep penetration raids into Germany. 10% meant that 1 out of every 10 bombers that took off wouldn't come back. On particularly bad days like Black Thursday, the rate hit 26%. These rates were absolutely unsustainable. You couldn't maintain an air offensive while losing a quarter of your force on a single mission. But by mid-1944, with Mustangs providing escort all the way to the target and back, the average loss rate for heavy bombers dropped dramatically to around 1%, 1 in 100 rather than 1 in 4. The P-51, along with improved tactics, better intelligence and other factors, had made the strategic bombing campaign sustainable and effective. Now let's look at the cost to the Luftwaffe, and this is where the numbers become truly staggering. General Doolittle's strategy of taking the fight to the German fighters, of actively hunting them rather than just passively defending the bombers, turned the air war into a brutal campaign of annihilation. In the first 5 months of 1944, the German fighter force on the Western Front simply ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The monthly loss numbers tell the story. In January 1944, they lost 443 fighters destroyed or damaged beyond repair. In February, 524. In March, 583. In April, 687. And in May, a truly staggering 758 aircraft gone. That's 2,495 fighters put out of action in just 5 months. By May, the Luftwaffe was losing more than half of its entire frontline single-engine fighter strength every single month. Think about that. Every month, over half the force was being replaced with new aircraft and new pilots, most of them inexperienced. But the machines could be replaced. German industry, despite the bombing, despite the shortages, was actually increasing fighter production through heroic efforts and ruthless prioritization. The real, irreplaceable losses were the pilots. From January through May of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 2,262 fighter pilots, either killed, missing, captured, or so seriously wounded they couldn't return to duty. At the beginning of the year, their entire single-engine fighter pilot force numbered approximately 2,395 men. They lost almost an entire Air Force's worth of pilots in just 5 months. The casualties were staggering, unsustainable, and they were accelerating. The training pipeline simply couldn't keep up with this rate of loss. The numbers tell a stark story. In April 1944 alone, the frontline fighter units lost 489 pilots. That same month, the training schools could only provide 396 replacement pilots. They were running a fatal deficit of nearly 100 pilots per month, and it was getting worse. Each month, the average experience level dropped. Each month, the survival rate for new pilots decreased. Each month, the situation became more hopeless. The final brutal verdict comes from the kill-to-loss ratios, the exchange rates in air combat. By late 1944, American fighter pilots were claiming more than 6 aerial victories for every one of their own fighters lost in air-to-air combat. 6 to 1. Even accounting for overclaiming, which happened on both sides, the actual ratio was probably somewhere around 4 to 1 in favor of the Americans. The skies over Germany had become a shooting gallery, a slaughter, with the Luftwaffe pilots as the targets. The P-51 Mustang was the primary instrument of this destruction. American Mustang pilots claimed 4,900 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter type. And those numbers don't even include the hundreds of German aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks, the locomotives and trains destroyed, the trucks strafed, the oil facilities damaged, or the psychological impact on German pilots who simply refused to take off when they knew Mustangs were in the area. The verdict of history, supported by these overwhelming numbers, is absolutely clear and undeniable. The P-51 Mustang, primarily because of its unprecedented range that allowed it to escort bombers anywhere and hunt German fighters everywhere, broke the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. It killed or wounded the experienced veterans faster than they could be replaced. It threw inexperienced replacement pilots into an unwinnable situation where they had no chance to survive and learn. And it shattered the morale and will to fight of the entire German fighter force by destroying the concept of sanctuary, by making every moment from takeoff to landing a life-threatening combat situation. The Mustang's greatest weapon, the thing that truly set it apart and made it so devastating, wasn't its 650 caliber machine guns, though they were certainly effective. It wasn't its speed or its climb rate or its maneuverability, though it excelled in all those areas. Its greatest weapon was something more fundamental and more psychologically damaging. It was simply the ability to be there, hundreds of miles deep in enemy territory, with enough fuel remaining to fight effectively and still make it home. That ability erased every advantage the Luftwaffe had carefully built up over years of combat. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang is permanently etched in the history of aerial warfare over Europe during the Second World War. It stands as perhaps the most influential single aircraft type in the European theatre, not because it was the best dogfighter, though it was certainly among the best, and not because it destroyed the most aircraft, though it claimed more than any other Allied fighter. Its enduring legacy comes from being exactly the right aircraft at exactly the right time, with exactly the right capabilities to solve a critical strategic problem that was threatening to derail the entire Allied air campaign. The Mustang was a technological key that unlocked the German fortress. It was the guardian angel that bomber crews had been desperately praying for. It was the grim reaper that haunted every German fighter pilot from takeoff to landing. But perhaps its deepest and most lasting impact was psychological. It fundamentally changed the entire mental framework of the air war in Europe. It transformed the German fighter pilot from a confident hunter, defending his homeland with skill and courage, into a hunted animal with nowhere safe to rest, nowhere to recover, no sanctuary where he could feel secure even for a moment. This psychological warfare through persistent presence was devastatingly effective. The Mustang didn't need to be everywhere at once. The German pilots just needed to know it could be anywhere, that any moment of the flight could bring those silver fighters diving out of the sun. That uncertainty, that constant stress, that knowledge that home was no longer safe, broke men just as surely as bullets and cannon shells did. In the end, the P-51 Mustang didn't just win air superiority over Europe, though it certainly did that. It won a comprehensive war of industrial attrition and psychological endurance. It proved that advanced industrial capability could project overwhelming power directly into the heart of enemy territory, that no homeland was truly safe from a determined attacker with sufficient reach, and that morale and will to fight could be systematically destroyed by the simple expedient of erasing all safe spaces and turning every moment into potential combat. It stands as perhaps the ultimate testament to a principle that has governed warfare since ancient times, but was demonstrated with unprecedented clarity in the air war over Europe. Sometimes, often in fact, the most powerful weapon of all is not the sharpest sword or the most powerful bomb. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the ability to be present, to reach your enemy wherever he goes, to deny him rest or sanctuary, to make him understand viscerally that there is no escape. The P-51 Mustang had that ability, and it used it to break the back of what had been one of the most formidable air forces the world had ever seen,